When I turned my truck down the cracked asphalt road that curved into Whispering Pines Valley, I felt a pull of nostalgia that I hadn't experienced in decades. The summer air carried the faint scent of pine resin and mountain dust, and each bend in the road revealed another snapshot from my childhood. Time had weathered much of it. What used to be a rough trail my grandfather carved out had now become a semi-paved lane, clearly maintained by someone other than me. That should have been my first warning sign. At the base of the valley stood the old wooden signpost. Its paint faded, but still legible. Whispering Pines, private property. I remembered watching my grandfather hammer that sign into the earth. He had always been proud of the land, proud of owning every ridge, every stream, and every clearing across the valley. It wasn't just a cabin in the woods. It was an entire swath of wilderness, passed down through our family since the early 1900s, and now, after years away, it was mine. I hadn't set foot here since my late 20s. Life had pulled me away. Jobs, responsibilities, the endless march of bills and obligations. But when the lawyers called after my father's passing, reminding me of the estate I now owned outright, I knew it was time to come back. I wanted to breathe mountain air again, to hear the echo of my boots on wooden porch steps, to see the river bend shining under the sun. But as I drove deeper into the valley, something didn't feel right. The land was supposed to be untouched, wild, raw, preserved. Instead, I saw signs of suburban order creeping in. A mailbox freshly painted, a picket fence that hadn't existed before, then, shockingly, actual houses. Not cabins built by hunters or families passing through, but polished homes with manicured lawns, flower beds, and driveways lined with SUVs. My heart sank as I realized what I was looking at, a modern neighborhood planted in the middle of my valley. I slowed the truck and stared. I didn't remember ever selling land. I didn't remember giving permission for development. Yet here stood row after row of identical homes, their vinyl siding gleaming, satellite dishes perched on rooftops, and children's bicycles left in driveways. At the entrance of this unexpected neighborhood, there was even a sign bolted to a post, Whispering Pines HOA, residents only. The words hit me like a slap. HOA, Homeowners Association? On my land? I parked my truck just outside the edge of the neighborhood and got out, the gravel crunching beneath my boots. The air smelled different here, the crispness of pine masked by the faint scent of fertilizer and asphalt. I walked past a row of houses, noticing the uniformity of mailboxes and the regulation heights of hedges. This wasn't the valley I had inherited. This was a suburban transplant, and it reeked of control. As I moved closer to the heart of the neighborhood, I caught sight of a figure standing at the end of a cul-de-sac. A woman, dressed in an immaculate pastel blouse and pressed khaki slacks, her posture rigid, arms crossed, eyes narrowing as she spotted me. She looked like she had stepped straight out of a suburban real estate brochure. Neat hair, clipboard tucked under one arm, and the aura of someone who believed authority was her birthright. I didn't need an introduction to know who she was. Every neighborhood had one, the self-appointed guardian of order. The queen bee of compliance, the HOA's iron fist. Her gaze scanned me up and down, lingering on the dust of the road clinging to my boots and the faded flannel shirt I wore. She looked at me as if I were an intruder, some trespasser daring to step foot in her perfect kingdom. And without saying a word, she pivoted, marched toward me, and made it abundantly clear that confrontation was imminent. But I didn't flinch. I had come here to reclaim my family's cabin, to reconnect with the land. What I hadn't expected was to find my valley transformed into a suburban battleground, policed by an HOA that had no rightful claim. The cabin itself sat further up the road, beyond the sprouting neighborhood. As I climbed back into my truck and drove, I tried to push aside the confusion. Maybe there had been some mistake, some lease or zoning quirk. Maybe the HOA only managed this pocket of homes, not the entire valley. But deep down, unease gnawed at me. When I finally saw the cabin, relief washed over me. It was still there, perched on the gentle rise overlooking the river bend. The logs were weathered but intact, the stone chimney standing proud. The porch sagged a little, and weeds curled up through the steps. but it was still mine. The sight of it made my chest tighten with both sorrow and joy. My father had breathed his last here. My grandfather had built it with his bare hands, and now it was my turn to restore it. I parked the truck and stepped onto the porch, running my hand across the railing. The wood was rough, but beneath it was history, memory, and ownership. No HOA sign, no manicured hedges, no pastel blouses could take that away from me. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, the valley filled with the golden glow of evening. For a brief moment, it felt as though nothing had changed. The wind carried the same whispers through the pines. The river sang the same melody it always had. But just as I began to settle into the comfort of being home, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. A car door slammed, and then the unmistakable sound of determined footsteps approaching the cabin. The queen bee of the HOA had followed me, and from the look on her face, she wasn't here for a neighborly welcome. The woman's heels dug into the gravel as she approached, each step sharp and deliberate, as though she intended to grind the very earth into submission beneath her shoes. She held a clipboard like a weapon, her knuckles pale against its edge, and her chin tilted upward with the kind of superiority only someone who had made themselves queen of a cul-de-sac could muster. The late evening sunlight caught the thin metal of her glasses, flashing like a blade as she stopped at the base of the cabin's porch. I remained still, one hand resting on the porch railing, the other hanging loose by my side. She didn't speak at first. Instead, she surveyed the cabin with narrowed eyes, scanning the sagging porch, the uncut grass, the moss streaking the chimney. Each detail seemed to offend her sense of order. I could almost hear the mental checklist forming in her head, items she would no doubt scribble onto her clipboard. Porch unsanctioned. Landscaping violation. Chimney a hazard. Structure non-compliant. Finally, she drew in a breath, the kind meant to announce her presence with authority. And though I braced for words, I didn't need them. Her expression said everything. She believed she was in charge here. She believed this cabin, this porch, this entire valley fell under her jurisdiction. But she was wrong. The silence between us stretched uncomfortably long. The trees rustled in the wind, the river murmured in the distance, and still she stood there, clipboard against her chest, waiting for me to yield. I didn't. That seemed to frustrate her. She shifted her weight, clicked her pen open, and jotted something quickly before looking back at me with a mixture of suspicion and disdain. It was in that moment I realized the battle lines had already been drawn. This wasn't just about a cabin in the woods. This was about control. I turned toward the cabin door, retrieved the old brass key from my pocket, and slid it into the lock. The metal groaned, the tumblers catching before finally releasing with a satisfying click. The door opened inward, the scent of cedar and dust rushing out to greet me. I stepped inside, letting the door hang open behind me, deliberately unbothered by the woman still planted outside like a sentinel. The cabin's interior was exactly as I remembered it, though dulled by time. Dust motes floated in the beams of light slicing through the windows. A quilt my grandmother had stitched decades ago still draped the back of the rocking chair. The stone fireplace sat dormant but solid, its blackened interior a reminder of countless winters. And on the far wall hung the framed deed, yellowed with age but still legible, declaring ownership of Whispering Pines Valley in its entirety under my family's name. The sight of that deed steadied me. It was the ultimate truth, the anchor in the storm. This land wasn't hers. It wasn't the HOA's. It wasn't any neighbors with their regulation shrubs and painted shutters. It was mine. As the evening settled deeper, I unpacked my truck, carrying in supplies and tools. Every trip back and forth from the porch, I caught glimpses of her, still standing there, occasionally scribbling notes, occasionally talking into a small walkie-talkie clipped to her waistband. She wasn't just curious. She was documenting, building a case, preparing for a confrontation larger than this quiet standoff. By the time the sun sank fully behind the ridge, painting the valley in indigo shadows, she finally retreated. Her car, a spotless silver SUV with personalized plates, reversed carefully down the gravel path, headlights sweeping across the cabin before disappearing into the night. For a moment, I thought perhaps she had realized her mistake. Perhaps she had accepted that this was private property, outside her reach. But I should have known better. People like her didn't retreat. They regrouped. The following morning proved it. I woke to the sound of engines. Multiple engines. Peering out the window, I saw a convoy of vehicles rolling up the gravel path. 2 SUVs, a pickup truck, and a small electric golf cart plastered with the HOA logo. They parked haphazardly along the road, doors opening, people spilling out. Men in polo shirts, women in visors, each carrying clipboards, cameras, or tablets. At their center, of course, was the Queen Bee herself. She wasted no time. While the others fanned out, snapping photos of the cabin, the trees, even the river, she strode up the porch once again, this time with a printout in her hand. She held it aloft like a warrant, though it was nothing more than a stapled packet. HOA bylaws, highlighted aggressively. Her group followed her lead, circling the cabin, muttering to one another as though they were inspecting a crime scene. I could feel their eyes on me even from inside, judging the peeling paint on the shutters, the uneven slope of the yard, the lack of a driveway. Every feature that spoke of wilderness, of authenticity, was being catalogued as a violation in their world of uniform perfection. I stepped onto the porch, the morning sun warming the wood beneath my boots. Again, I said nothing. I didn't need to. My silence was resistance enough, and it infuriated them. Their leader flipped through her packet with exaggerated gestures, pointing to lines of text, turning to her peers for nods of approval. But approval or not, it didn't matter. HOA bylaws had no power here. Still, they acted as though they did. By noon, bright plastic stakes appeared in the ground near the cabin. Caution tape fluttered between them, cordoning off sections of the yard as though construction were imminent. A laminated notice was taped to the cabin door, covered in bold red letters declaring, "Immediate action required." Immediate action? Required by whom? Certainly not by me. The deed on the wall inside was older and stronger than any piece of laminated paper they could produce. But it was clear what they were doing: intimidation. They wanted me to feel like a trespasser on my own land. I tore the notice down, crumpled it in my hand, and tossed it into the fire pit outside. The flames devoured it quickly, leaving only ash. From the corner of my eye, I saw them watching, whispering, documenting the act as if it were defiance against lawful authority. But what they couldn't grasp was simple. They had no lawful authority here at all. The tension simmered all afternoon. Their convoy finally departed as the shadows lengthened, though not before setting up a trail camera at the end of the gravel path, aimed directly at the cabin's approach. I found it within an hour, dismantled it, and placed it neatly at the edge of the road. Another message: you do not control this land. I do, yet I knew this wasn't over. People like them thrived on escalation. They wouldn't rest until they believed they had won. And the woman at the center of it all, the Karen of Whispering Pines HOA, was clearly gearing up for war. As night fell once more, I sat on the porch with a lantern glowing at my side, listening to the chorus of crickets. The cabin was sturdy, the land quiet, but beneath the peace was an undercurrent of storm. Tomorrow would bring another round. I could feel it, and deep down I knew they hadn't yet discovered the full truth. The HOA believed they ruled a neighborhood. They believed they could expand their reach. What they didn't yet realize was that their suburban colony was a mere fragment of a much larger picture. A picture in which I wasn't just a homeowner. I wasn't just a cabin owner. I was the owner of the entire valley, and when they finally learned that truth, the real battle would begin. Morning in Whispering Pines Valley had always been a peaceful affair, or at least that's how I remembered it. The mist rising from the river, the chorus of birds calling from the treetops, the way sunlight stretched slowly across the ridges, it had once been a kind of sacred rhythm. But on the third day of my return, that rhythm was broken. The peace was gone, replaced by the mechanical hum of engines and the shrill bark of voices carried up the path. The HOA had returned. This time, they didn't arrive as a small delegation. No, this time they came as a force. 3 SUVs, 2 golf carts and a utility trailer rumbled into view, parking along the road with deliberate obstruction, as if blocking me in. A dozen people spilled out, armed not with rifles or axes, but with clipboards, warning placards, measuring tapes, and cameras. It was their version of an invading army, paperwork as weapons, bylaws as bullets. At their center was the Queen Bee herself. Karen, as I had started calling her in my mind, wore a sun hat pulled low over her carefully styled hair. Her pastel blouse was tucked crisply into her khaki pants, and her shoes gleamed as though she had polished them for battle. She held her clipboard in one hand, her pen in the other, and her expression said she wasn't here for negotiation. She was here to conquer. Her group fanned out quickly. 2 men planted a large sandwich board sign at the edge of the gravel path leading to the cabin. Bold letters declared, "Notice of Non-Compliance." Beneath it, smaller text listed vague accusations: unauthorized dwelling, unapproved landscaping, safety violations, unauthorized occupancy. It was almost laughable, if not for the sheer audacity. Unauthorized occupancy out of my own land, unapproved landscaping, of wilderness that had thrived long before their neat hedges existed, and safety violations of a cabin that had stood for nearly a century, weathering storms harsher than any HOA committee. But they weren't laughing. They moved with purpose, measuring the distance from the porch to the road, photographing the chimney, scribbling notes about the yard. Each gesture was theatrical, meant to intimidate, meant to make me feel as though their authority was law. I didn't move from the porch. I sat in the old rocking chair, the quilt still draped over its back, watching them with steady eyes. My calmness unsettled them. They wanted confrontation, panic, resistance, something they could spin into justification. Instead, I gave them silence. By mid-morning, their efforts escalated. Brightly colored violation notices were taped across the cabin's windows, doors, and even the porch railing. Plastic stakes were hammered into the ground, strung with neon tape, marking off areas they deemed non-compliant. At one point, a man even attempted to place a padlock on the old shed beside the cabin, claiming it was unsafe for use. I walked over, removed the padlock from his hands, and placed it gently back into his palm. No words exchanged, but the message was clear. Not on my land. The group bristled at my defiance. Karen conferred with 2 of her lieutenants, flipping through thick binders of rules and regulations. They spoke in hushed but hurried tones, pointing toward me, toward the cabin, toward the ridge. I caught fragments of their whispers. Set precedent. Illegal dwelling. Enforcement action. Enforcement action. That phrase rang in my ears long after they packed up their signs and tools for the day. They weren't going away. They were building toward something bigger, something more aggressive. This campaign of intimidation was only the beginning. That evening, as I walked the perimeter of the cabin with a lantern, I noticed new intrusions. Small wooden stakes with reflective tape had been driven into the ground at intervals along the path. Survey markers, the kind developers used when they wanted to claim space. And at the base of one, a laminated note fluttered. Property line in dispute. Subject to HOA review. Property line in dispute? There was no dispute. The deed hanging on my cabin wall was clear. My grandfather had purchased the valley outright nearly a century ago, and it had been passed down cleanly without mortgage or lien to my father and then to me. The boundary lines weren't vague. They weren't negotiable. They encompassed the entire valley, from ridge to ridge, from river bend to meadow. Still, their presence forced me to act. The next morning, I pulled the deed from its frame and spread it across the cabin table. The parchment was old but meticulously preserved, stamped with county seals and signatures of long-dead officials. The description left no room for argument. Whispering Pines Valley, inclusive of all structures, waterways, ridges, and meadows contained therein. I photographed the document carefully, each page, each seal. Then I drove into town, heading straight for the county courthouse. The clerk, a weary man who looked as though he had seen every kind of land dispute imaginable, pulled up the property records at my request. His eyebrows lifted as he scrolled through the files. The valley was indeed recorded under my family's name, uninterrupted ownership stretching back nearly a century. No easements, No subdivisions, no homeowners association filings. When I asked about the development that had sprung up, the clerk sighed. Apparently, in the late 1990s, a developer had applied to build on the edge of the valley, but the application was denied due to lack of ownership. Somehow, despite the denial, houses were built anyway, creeping slowly into the valley over the following years. The record showed no transfer of land, no legitimate sale. It was, on paper, unauthorized construction. The clerk shook his head. Messy, he muttered. Real messy. Messy indeed. Armed with copies of the records and certified proof of ownership, I returned to the valley. The evidence in my hand was ironclad. The HOA might wield bylaws like weapons, but I had the law itself on my side. Still, I knew people like Karen. Facts didn't matter. Control did. Sure enough, when I returned, they were waiting. Another convoy lined the road, but this time they had come prepared for confrontation. A folding table had been set up near the cabin, covered with stacks of papers, binders, and a portable printer. Behind it sat 3 individuals in business attire, lawyers, by the look of them. Karen stood proudly at their side, arms folded, chin lifted, as if she had summoned an army of bureaucrats to crush me. She gestured grandly toward the table as I approached, as though inviting me to submit myself to their process. The lawyers leafed through documents, some printed with HOA letterheads, others looking suspiciously like hastily drawn contracts. I recognized the strategy immediately: overwhelm, confuse, pressure. They wanted me to believe their paperwork held more weight than the deed I carried, but I wasn't so easily swayed. I laid my certified copies on the table, each page stamped by the county clerk. The lawyers leaned in, reading carefully, their brows furrowing as the truth sank in. Karen, however, refused to acknowledge it. She waved dismissively, launching into a monologue about community standards and shared responsibilities. Her voice grew sharper, louder, as though volume could replace authority. The lawyers didn't echo her confidence. They whispered among themselves, shuffling papers, avoiding my eyes. They knew the truth. The HOA had no standing here, no jurisdiction. Their bylaws applied only to properties legally sold within their association, not to my valley, not to my cabin. But Karen wasn't about to retreat. Instead, she doubled down. The next day, bright orange stop work notices appeared on the cabin door, despite no work being done. A warning letter arrived, stuffed under the cabin window, claiming I owed thousands in unpaid HOA dues. And late one night, I caught 2 men attempting to measure the property again, their flashlights cutting through the dark until I stepped onto the porch with my lantern, sending them scattering like startled deer. It was harassment, plain and simple. A campaign designed to break me, to push me out, to make me surrender what was rightfully mine. But the more they pressed, the firmer I stood. The deed was my shield. The valley was my heritage. And no clipboard, no pastel blouse, no sandwich board sign could strip that away. Still, tension thickened with each passing day. The HOA's tactics were growing bolder, their intrusions more invasive. And though I held the truth in my hands, I knew this was heading toward a breaking point. Because Karen wasn't just fighting for rules. She was fighting for power. And people like her didn't stop until they were forced to. The real storm was still coming. By the 4th week of my return to Whispering Pines Valley, the HOA's presence had shifted from nuisance to outright warfare. The days of pastel notices and polite harassment were gone. In their place came threats wrapped in legal jargon, uninvited incursions onto my property, and tactics that revealed just how desperate they were to maintain their illusion of control. It began with the mail, or rather what they claimed was mail. I would wake each morning to find envelopes taped to my cabin door, all bearing the HOA's letterhead in bold green print. The contents were always the same, escalating threats disguised as formal correspondence. Notice of outstanding dues. Violation of architectural standards. Cease and desist. Each letter grew more aggressive, citing bylaws and fines that spiraled into the tens of thousands. Of course, I knew these letters held no legal weight. They were nothing more than paper tigers. But their intent was clear, to bury me beneath a mountain of fabricated debt and intimidation until I surrendered. What they failed to grasp was that my family had survived far worse than a handful of officious letters. My grandfather had held this land through the Great Depression. My father had defended it against land developers in the 1970s, and now it was my turn. The letters didn't stop me, so they escalated. One morning, as I walked the perimeter, I noticed something strange at the river bend. Where the water usually flowed clear and cold, it now carried a faint sheen of oil, rainbow colors rippling across the surface. A closer inspection revealed the source. A stack of discarded paint cans and chemicals dumped upriver, their lids deliberately loosened. The pristine water that had nourished the valley for generations was now tainted. It was no accident. Someone wanted me to feel the sting of violation, to believe my valley wasn't safe under my care. The cleanup took days. I hauled the rusted cans out of the riverbed, scrubbing rocks and filtering water through makeshift screens. As I worked, I couldn't shake the image of Karen standing smugly on her manicured lawn, clipboard in hand, convinced her HOA kingdom had extended its reach. This was no longer about bylaws. It was sabotage. That night, I sat by the fireplace, the deed spread across the table beside me, illuminated by the flickering glow. My resolve hardened with every crackle of the fire. They wanted me gone, erased, forgotten. But I wasn't leaving. Not now. Not ever. Days later, their tactics grew bolder still. I returned from a supply run in town to find the cabin door ajar. My stomach dropped as I stepped inside, scanning the room. At first, nothing seemed missing. The quilt still hung on the rocking chair, the dishes still lined the shelf, the deed still rested safely in its frame. But then I noticed the lantern on the table, its glass chimney shattered, its oil spilled deliberately across the wood. Had I not been delayed in town, the cabin could have burned to the ground. They had crossed a line. I spent that night on the porch with a lantern and a rifle across my lap. The valley was quiet, but every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch set my heart racing. Somewhere out there among the shadows, I knew they were watching. They wanted me unsettled, paranoid, broken. Instead, their actions had forged my determination into steel. But even as I braced myself, their campaign stretched beyond the valley. When I returned to the courthouse to follow up on property records, I discovered a fresh filing, a petition by the HOA to annex disputed land into their jurisdiction. The audacity was staggering. They were attempting to rewrite history itself, to pretend that my family's ownership never existed. Fortunately, the law wasn't on their side. The clerk confirmed the petition lacked foundation, noting it would likely be dismissed outright. Still, the very act of filing showed their intent. They weren't retreating. They were doubling down, willing to exhaust every avenue, no matter how baseless, to grind me into submission. Meanwhile, the valley itself bore the scars of their desperation. Trail cameras reappeared, nailed to trees under cover of darkness. Wooden signs declaring HOA boundary were hammered into the soil at random, as though they could redraw lines with a few planks of plywood. Once, I even found a group of them erecting a temporary fence along the ridge, its flimsy metal posts wobbling in the wind. When I approached, they scattered, leaving the half-built barrier behind like a carcass of their failed conquest. But the most chilling moment came one stormy night. Rain lashed the cabin roof, wind howled through the valley, and thunder rattled the windows. In the flashes of lightning, I saw them. Figures standing at the edge of the tree line, umbrellas raised, watching silently. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, a row of silhouettes against the storm. For an hour, they remained, a silent jury passing judgment, until finally the storm swallowed them whole and they vanished back into the darkness. The next morning, muddy footprints ringed the cabin. They had come closer than I thought. Too close. It was then I realized this wasn't merely a territorial dispute. This was psychological warfare. They wanted me afraid to sleep, afraid to step outside, afraid to call the valley mine. But they underestimated the valley itself. These ridges had cradled my family for generations. The pines whispered of resilience, the river sang of endurance, and the stones beneath the cabin carried the memory of every battle fought here before. So, I made my move. With the certified deed in hand, I returned to the courthouse once again, not just to confirm ownership, but to expand the record. I requested fresh surveys, new filings, and digital documentation to ensure no claim could ever obscure the truth. Whispering Pines Valley, in its entirety, belonged to me, legally, historically, undeniably. The clerk, sensing the weight of the situation, stamped each document with deliberate care. When I left, I carried not just paper but proof carved into the very bedrock of the county's archives. Proof that no HOA, no Karen, no army of clipboards could erase. When I returned to the cabin, the valley greeted me with its familiar stillness. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the meadow. But I knew this was only the calm before the storm. The HOA had shown their willingness to poison rivers, tamper with locks, and invade under cover of darkness. Paper would not stop them. Only confrontation would. That night, as I placed the freshly stamped documents beside the deed on the table, I felt a shift deep within me. This was no longer about simply reclaiming my family's cabin. This was about defending an entire valley against those who sought to twist it into their own image of control. The war had escalated. Sabotage and legal threats were just the beginning. The next phase would be something larger, louder, and far more dangerous. And when it came, I would be ready. By the 5th week, Whispering Pines Valley no longer felt like the secluded refuge it once had been. The river still wound its silver path through the meadow, the pines still swayed in the mountain winds, and the cabin still stood strong on its rise. But the atmosphere was different, heavier, charged. The HOA's constant pressure had turned the valley into a battleground where silence was loaded, where every creak of branches could signal another intrusion. Their campaign had evolved beyond notices and sabotage. They had shifted to spectacle. One crisp morning, I awoke to the rumble of heavy engines echoing through the valley. When I stepped onto the porch, I was met with a sight that tightened my chest. A caravan of trucks crawling up the gravel path. Their beds loaded with construction equipment, backhoes, cement mixers, pallets of fencing. At their front, as always, was Karen, perched proudly in her spotless SUV, sunglasses reflecting the rising sun like a shield of arrogance. They spilled out in practiced formation. Workers in neon vests unloaded tools, rolling out tape measures and spray paint, marking lines through the grass as though preparing for excavation. Behind them, HOA board members arranged folding chairs in neat rows, setting up what looked like a tribunal right there in the valley. At its center, a podium was placed, adorned with a banner that read, "Whispering Pines HOA, Community Hearing." A community hearing. On my land, theatrics were their weapon of choice now. They weren't just trying to intimidate me privately anymore. They wanted a show, to broadcast authority. To drown the valley in their staged sense of legitimacy, Karen took the podium like a politician at a campaign rally. Papers rustled in her hand, her voice sharp and carrying across the meadow. Though I couldn't hear every word from the porch, the tone was unmistakable. Condemnation disguised as procedure, judgment dressed as bureaucracy. She pointed toward the cabin, gesturing dramatically as if it were a criminal hideout rather than a family home. Her followers nodded dutifully, pens scratching across clipboards as though their agreement could somehow rewrite the deed that proved their powerlessness. But she wasn't speaking just to them. She was speaking to the workers, the ones handling the equipment. They had been told a story, no doubt, that the land was disputed, that a squatter had taken root, that they were here to enforce order. To them, the valley wasn't heritage. It was a contract, a job, a paycheck. By midday, stakes were hammered into the ground around the cabin. Spray-painted lines carved across the meadow, slicing the landscape into parcels like a butcher, marking cuts of meat. They weren't hiding their intentions anymore. They planned to subdivide, to fence, to absorb. I knew words alone wouldn't stop them. So I retrieved the documents, the certified deed, the stamped surveys, the proof I had carried from the courthouse. With steady steps, I walked down from the porch, through the spray paint and caution tape, and laid the papers on their podium for all to see. A hush fell over the group. Workers paused, clipboards lowered, whispers darted like insects in the air. Karen froze, her pen hovering above her notes, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the stamped seals. Her jaw tightened, her face flushing red beneath her carefully applied makeup. She knew what it meant, but rather than concede, she snapped, Her voice rose in a shrill crescendo, accusing me of forgery, of harassment, of standing in the way of community progress. She waved her hands wildly, rallying her board members with venomous certainty. They chimed in with echoes of her rhetoric, but the workers were less convinced. They shifted uneasily, glancing between Karen's fury and the official county seals glaring back at them from the papers. Theatrics faltered in the face of truth. Sensing her grip loosening, Karen escalated further. Within days, county inspectors arrived, summoned by complaints filed under the HOA's name. Clipboards and hard hats replaced the pastel blouses, but the game was the same. Walk the property, list supposed violations, threaten fines and demolitions. I met them each time with the same defense: the deed, the surveys, the records. Some inspectors nodded quietly, understanding the futility of their orders. Others shuffled awkwardly, muttering about being just here to do their job. But each left without action, their threats dissolving into the mountain air. Still, the harassment didn't stop. If anything, the failures only fueled Karen's desperation. One afternoon, I discovered the cabin's well pump had been tampered with. The pipes were loosened, bolts scattered in the dirt, leaving the system useless. Days later, tire tracks scarred the meadow, deep ruts carved deliberately across the grass near the river bend. And one evening, as the sun dipped below the ridge, I found bright spray paint scrawled across the cabin wall. HOA property. Each act was meant to break me, to wear me down through exhaustion, to make me believe I couldn't endure the constant siege. But every act only stoked the fire inside me. The valley wasn't just mine on paper. It was mine in blood, in history, in memory. Each attack made my bond with it stronger, my resolve sharper. Yet even with my determination, I couldn't deny the toll. Nights grew restless, ears straining for footsteps in the dark. Days grew heavy with the weight of constant vigilance. My solitude, once a sanctuary, was now a prison of watchfulness. I could feel the strain seeping into my bones, whispering that the valley's battle might demand more than I could give. And then came the moment that proved how far they were willing to go. It was a Friday evening when I spotted smoke curling above the ridge. Panic surged through me as I sprinted toward it, heart pounding against my ribs. There, in a clearing not far from the cabin, flames licked at a pile of brush, a fire set deliberately, its edges creeping toward the pines. With frantic effort, I smothered it, hauling water from the river, beating back sparks with a blanket until the danger was contained. The air reeked of gasoline, the earth blackened and scarred. Arson. They had resorted to fire. I sat in the ash until the stars emerged, my chest heaving with exhaustion and fury. They had poisoned the river, broken into the cabin, vandalized the walls, and now tried to burn the valley itself. This wasn't harassment anymore. It was war. The next morning, I returned to the courthouse for the last time, not to gather records, but to take action. I filed official reports of trespass, vandalism, and arson, attaching photographs and evidence. The clerk's eyes widened as he read the details, his pen scratching furiously across forms. By the time I left, the wheels of the law were turning. Slow, perhaps, but turning nonetheless. Back at the cabin, I prepared for the inevitable retaliation. The valley was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that precedes a storm. The HOA had thrown everything at me: paperwork, sabotage, intimidation, fire. And each time, they had failed. But Karen's obsession ran deeper than failure. She would not stop until she was broken, or until I was. As I sat on the porch that night, the lantern casting long shadows across the railing, I knew the climax was near. The valley had endured every scheme, every trespass, every attack. But the final showdown was yet to come, and when it did, the truth of ownership and the fate of Whispering Pines Valley would be decided once and for all. The final act of Whispering Pines Valley's drama began not with a bang, but with an eerie calm. After weeks of constant harassment, vandalism, sabotage, and outright arson, the valley seemed strangely still. The pines whispered in the breeze. The river traced its familiar silver line, and for the first time in days, there was no growl of engines, no hammering of stakes, no shrill voice echoing through the meadow. but I knew better than to trust the silence. It was the pause before the storm, the kind of breathless moment when predators crouch before they strike. The signs came slowly at first. A stack of HOA newsletters appeared at the edge of my driveway, weighted down with a rock as though left like an offering. Bold headlines screamed accusations, illegal occupation in Whispering Pines Valley, and community members at risk. The narrative had shifted from vague complaints to full-blown propaganda. They weren't just targeting me anymore. They were rewriting the story for anyone who might listen, painting me as the invader, the villain. Then came the letters. Not the usual flimsy notices, but thick envelopes sealed in plastic, stamped with logos and law firm insignias. Inside were demands dressed up in legalese, eviction threats, cease and desist orders, and fabricated violations. Each letter tried to sound more official than the last, stacking intimidation atop intimidation, but the paper war was the least of it. On the third night of this strange calm, headlights cut through the darkness. Dozens of vehicles crept into the valley, engines rumbling in unison. Trucks, SUVs, and sedans lined the meadow like a blockade, their beams converging on the cabin as though staging a siege. HOA board members stepped out in their pastel uniforms of authority, clipboards in hand, faces grim. Behind them were outsiders, people I didn't recognize. Contractors, security guards, even a man in a cheap suit clutching a megaphone. They had gathered an army. Karen led them, of course. At the front of the procession, she stood tall, her heels sinking slightly into the meadow grass, sunglasses perched even in the night as though shielding her from more than light. The megaphone passed into her hands, and her voice pierced the stillness. It wasn't a demand this time. It was a declaration. She announced to everyone present, and to me by extension, that the HOA had voted to reclaim Whispering Pines Valley, that I had been deemed an unauthorized occupant, and that by dawn, the cabin would be demolished to make way for community development. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the group. Some cheered, others shifted uneasily, but all eyes turned to the cabin. I stayed seated on the porch, lantern casting its glow over the deed spread across the table beside me. I let her speech wash over me, every word dripping with false authority, every promise of progress masking naked greed. Theatrics again, and only this time it wasn't a stage show. It was their final strike, and they had chosen the wrong battlefield. Before Karen could finish her proclamation, the distant wail of sirens sliced through the night. Red and blue lights painted the trees, bouncing across the meadow as county sheriff's vehicles rolled in. Doors slammed, boots hit the ground, and within moments, deputies formed a barrier between the HOA mob and the cabin. The effect was immediate. The crowd's confidence wavered, cheers faltered, and whispers of panic threaded through their ranks. Karen, however, did not flinch. Her face twisted with indignation as the sheriff himself approached, broad-shouldered and steady, his flashlight beam cutting through the chaos. He carried my file under his arm. The very reports I had filed, trespassing, vandalism, arson. Each stamped and logged, each backed by evidence. The truth had arrived in uniform. Karen tried to rally, brandishing her stack of newsletters and forged documents, waving them like holy scripture. She shouted over the deputies, declaring authority, demanding action. But for the first time, her voice sounded strained. The sheriff held up the certified deed, its embossed seal catching the light, and the weight of reality sank into the meadow. "This land," he announced for all to hear, "is privately owned. The cabin, the river, the valley, all of it." He paused, scanning the crowd, his words deliberate and final. "And it does not fall under the jurisdiction of the Whispering Pines HOA." The silence that followed was crushing. The board members exchanged nervous glances, their clipboards suddenly looking like toys in their hands. Contractors shuffled backward, muttering to each other, unwilling to risk involvement in what was now clearly illegal. Even the security guards loosened their stances, eyes darting to the retreating shadows at the edges of the meadow. But Karen refused to yield. Her face flushed crimson. Her voice cracked as she screamed accusations at the sheriff, at me, at her own board for failing to enforce order. She clawed at the documents, calling them fraudulent, insisting the valley belonged to the HOA by right of community vision. She grew louder, more frantic, until her words tumbled into incoherence, a storm of rage and denial. It was then, under the glare of headlights and the gaze of dozens of witnesses, that the sheriff turned and gave a quiet order. 2 deputies stepped forward, hands firm but steady, and guided Karen away from the podium she had claimed as her throne. Her protests echoed through the valley, but her power had evaporated. Theatrics had met reality, and reality had won. The crowd dispersed quickly after that. Vehicles pulled away one by one, leaving only tire tracks in the dirt and the lingering stench of gasoline. The folding chairs were abandoned, the spray-painted stakes left crooked in the grass. By dawn, the valley was mine again, quiet, whole, undivided. But victory did not feel triumphant. It felt sobering. The weeks of harassment had scarred the valley. The well pump still needed repair. The meadow still bore the wounds of tire ruts and spray paint. The scorched patch from the fire still lay blackened, a reminder of how close destruction had come. The HOA had been defeated, but the damage they caused lingered like ghosts. Yet amid the scars, resilience shone through. The river still flowed, unbothered by borders. The pines still reached for the sky, indifferent to petty squabbles. The cabin still stood, weathered but unbroken, its timbers holding the memory of those who built it and the defiance of those who protected it. In the weeks that followed, the sheriff's office pursued charges against several HOA members: trespassing, vandalism, reckless endangerment. The list grew long, and the board's once pristine reputation unraveled quickly. Neighbors who once whispered support now distanced themselves, unwilling to be tethered to Karen's downfall, and Karen herself. Rumors swirled. Some said she had been forced out of her position. Others claimed she had moved away, retreating to another unsuspecting neighborhood where she might rise again. But here, in Whispering Pines Valley, her reign was finished. For me, the valley returned to its rhythm, slowly, patiently, like a wound knitting itself closed. I repaired the pump, reseeded the meadow, painted over the vandalized wall. Each act of restoration was an act of defiance, proof that their attempts to erase me had failed. And as the weeks turned into months, I came to realize something deeper. The battle had never been about paperwork or fences, not really. It had been about belonging, about legacy, about the bond between people and the land that shapes them. The HOA had tried to commodify the valley, to slice it into parcels and sell it as community progress. But the valley was not a commodity. It was a living memory, one that pulsed in the river's flow, in the pine's sway, in the quiet resilience of its soil. Standing once more on the porch, overlooking the meadow as the sun painted it gold, I felt the weight of the deed in my hand. Not as a weapon, not as a shield, but as a reminder. A reminder that some things cannot be bullied, cannot be bought, cannot be erased. The HOA had lost. Karen had fallen, and Whispering Pines Valley was mine, and that's how one HOA Karen finally lost it all when the truth came out. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to HOA Story Files for more unbelievable HOA drama, wild neighborhood battles, and property showdowns you won't hear anywhere else.